Welcome to Mysteries to Solve. In 1911, a chambermaid walked into a hotel room carrying a lit candle. Somewhere in that room, gas had been quietly leaking for hours. The explosion that followed was so powerful, it blew her clean through the floor into the dining room below. She survived. 63 years later, a struggling horror writer named Stephen King checked into that exact same room, room 217, on a night when he and his wife were the only two guests in the entire hotel. By morning, he had the outline for one of the best-selling horror novels of all time. This isn't a ghost story someone made up for Halloween. This is the real, documented history of the Stanley Hotel. And honestly, the true story is stranger than the movie. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly why this hotel became a legend. And it has almost nothing to do with what you think. Freeland Oscar Stanley, F.O. Stanley, was one half of a set of identical twins born in 1849 in a tiny town in Maine. He and his brother Francis weren't ordinary farm boys. Together, they built the Stanley Dry Plate Company, which made them genuinely wealthy. And then they built something even more famous, the Stanley Steamer, one of the earliest and most successful steam-powered automobiles in America. So by the early 1900s, F.O. Stanley was rich, respected, and successful. He was also dying of tuberculosis. Remember, this is before antibiotics. TB was a death sentence for a huge percentage of people who got it. Doctors of the era believed thin, dry mountain air could help patients recover. So in 1903, weak and underweight, Stanley made the long journey out to a remote valley in the Colorado Rockies called Estes Park. Here's the part that sounds made up, but isn't. One summer in that mountain air, and his health completely turned around. He didn't just recover, he fell in love with the place, and decided he was going to build something there that the world had never seen.
At the time, Estes Park had a couple of dirt roads and not much else. Stanley didn't just build a hotel, he basically built the infrastructure of an entire town first. He personally funded road improvements. He established the town's first bank. He built the power, water, and sewer systems. Then, on June 22, 1909, the Stanley Hotel opened its doors. And here's the detail most people don't know. This wasn't just a pretty building in the mountains. It was a genuine engineering marvel. The Stanley Hotel was one of the very first hotels anywhere to have electricity running through the entire building, a rarity even in New York or Boston at the time. It had telephones in the rooms, ensuite bathrooms, steam heat. Out here, in a valley you could barely reach by road, F.O. Stanley built one of the most technologically advanced hotels in the country. This was the Gilded Age. Wealthy families were building opulent resorts all over the country, but most of them didn't survive long. The upkeep costs were brutal, and fortunes changed with the times. The Stanley Hotel was about to learn that the hard way. Now, here's where the real history and the ghost history start to blur, because this next event actually happened, and it's the reason room 217 became famous decades before Stephen King ever set foot in it. On the night of June 25th, 1911, a violent storm knocked out power across the hotel. Remember, this was cutting-edge technology for 1909, but it wasn't reliable technology, so staff went room to room lighting gas lanterns to keep guests comfortable. One of those staff members was the head chambermaid, a woman named Elizabeth Wilson. She walked into room 217, which at the time was the hotel's presidential suite, carrying a lit candle. What she didn't know was that a gas leak had filled the room. The explosion tore through part of the hotel. Some accounts say it blew out roughly a tenth of the building's structure. Witnesses reported the blast was so violent it launched Wilson down through the floor and into the dining room below. Somehow, she survived, with broken ankles and serious injuries, but alive. And this is the detail that says a lot about who F.O. Stanley actually was. He didn't just cover her medical bills. He
her full wages while she recovered, and when she came back, he promoted her to head chambermaid. She worked at that hotel for decades, into the 1950s. So when people today talk about the ghost of room 217, who tidies up guests' suitcases and tucks blankets around sleeping couples at night, that legend is built on a real woman with a real name who really survived a real explosion in that real room. That's what makes the Stanley different from most haunted hotel content on YouTube. The story underneath the legend is documented history.
Here's the twist most people don't expect. F.O. Stanley, the man whose name is on the building, only actually owned the hotel for about 2 decades. He sold the property, the power plant, and the surrounding land in the mid-1920s, and what followed was rough. Over the next several decades, the hotel passed through a string of owners who all struggled with the same problem. A huge, aging luxury building is extremely expensive to maintain, especially once the Gilded Age money and glamour that built it had faded. By the 1970s, the Stanley Hotel wasn't the crown jewel of Colorado anymore. It was tired, underfunded, barely surviving season to season. And that decline, that specific, unglamorous financial decline, is exactly what set the stage for the night that changed everything. In the fall of 1974, a young writer named Stephen King and his wife Tabitha were driving through Estes Park. He'd just published his first novel, Carrie, earlier that year. He wasn't the legend he is now, just a guy trying to make it. Darkness fell. They spotted the Stanley Hotel and pulled in, hoping for a room. Here's the detail that makes this feel almost too perfect. The hotel was literally closing for the season. Staff was a skeleton crew, and when the Kings checked in, they discovered something unsettling. They were the only guests in the entire hotel. They were given room 217, the same room, the same explosion room from 1911. That night, after a few drinks and a round of ghost stories from the bar manager, King went to sleep and had a nightmare so vivid he described it later almost word for word. He dreamed of his 3-year-old son running through the hotel's long corridors, screaming, being chased by a fire hose that had somehow come alive. He woke up in a cold sweat, went out to the balcony, lit a cigarette, and by the time he put it out, he had the entire framework of a new novel. That novel was The Shining. And here's the twist within the twist. Stanley Kubrick's famous 1980 film wasn't actually filmed at the real Stanley Hotel. That movie used a different location entirely. But the idea, the DNA, the atmosphere, all of it came from one real, documented, freezing night in Estes Park, Colorado. Here's the part of the story that's honestly the most interesting to me, because it's not about ghosts, it's about marketing. A struggling, half-empty, financially bleeding hotel had just accidentally inspired one of the best-selling horror novels in American history. And decades later, when a new owner named John Cullen bought the property in 1995, he understood exactly what he had. He leaned all the way into it. He built ghost tours. He told the real stories. The tuberculosis, the explosion, Elizabeth Wilson, Stephen King's night in room 217. And he let guests draw their own conclusions about what might still be lingering in those halls. The timing helped too. The internet was just becoming a tool for exactly this kind of storytelling. And Denver's new international airport, opened in 1995, made the once remote hotel suddenly easy to reach. The result? A hotel that was quietly dying in the 1970s is now one of the most visited, most talked about hotels in America. And it's almost entirely because of one unplanned, uncomfortable, freezing night in 1974. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you ghosts are real. What I can tell you is that the Stanley has more documented, reported paranormal activity than almost any hotel in the country. Guests reporting cold spots on the main staircase, staff talking about seeing F.O. and Flora Stanley near the piano in the music room, stories about children's laughter echoing on the 4th floor, where hotel staff historically kept their kids during the season. Are these ghosts? Or is it a 115-year-old building with creaky pipes, old wiring, drafty windows, and a very good story attached to it? Honestly, that's part of the fun.
you get to decide. From a dying man chasing mountain air, to a marvel of 1909 engineering, to a real explosion, to one cursed room, to the book that saved it all, the Stanley Hotel's true story doesn't need a single fake ghost to be one of the wildest tales in American history. If you want me to go deeper on room 217, or break down what's real versus Hollywood in The Shining itself, let me know in the comments. And subscribe, because I'm covering more of history's strangest true stories every week.